I woke up to the sound of buzzing, not the usual, comforting hum of my bees, but something more frantic, more angry. At first, I thought it was just another morning in my little paradise of honey-making, but then I saw it. My jars. My precious, golden jars of honey. Gone. The wooden shelves where I had carefully placed them were nearly empty, save for a few sticky smudges and a single overturned lid on the floor. My heart pounded as I ran to the window, and that's when I saw her. Karen, my entitled, boundary-stomping neighbor, smugly loading the stolen jars into her SUV like they were groceries she had paid for. She didn't even bother to sneak around. No guilt, no hesitation. She wiped a smudge of honey off the lid with her sleeve, licked it off her finger, and smiled. The audacity of that woman could power a city. My hands clenched into fists, and a dozen possible reactions raced through my mind. Call the cops? Confront her? Release the bees? The last option seemed extreme, but at that moment, I wasn't against a little nature-backed justice. Karen had always been a thorn in my side. She was the type who thought fences were just suggestions and other people's property was up for debate. She had taken my garden tools, borrowed my wheelbarrow for months, and once even threw a party that ended with a broken gate and an overturned beehive. That day, I had to chase down a cloud of bees for hours, calming them like an overworked mother. But this was a different level. My honey wasn't just some backyard hobby, it was my livelihood, my pride, my passion. And Karen had stolen it like it was a free sample at the grocery store. I stormed out the back door, fully prepared to unleash the kind of verbal wrath that would make a sailor blush, but by the time I reached the driveway, she was already backing out, waving at me like we were old friends. "Thanks for the honey," she called, flashing her too white, too fake smile. "It's amazing. You should really sell it at the farmer's market." I stood there, stunned, my brain trying to process the sheer level of Karen-ness I had just witnessed. Sell it at the market? Sell it at the market? She had stolen my honey and was now giving me business advice? As her car disappeared down the road, my mind went from shock to strategy. I wasn't just going to let this go. No, no, no. I had a rule. Mess with my garden, I'll scowl at you. Mess with my bees, I'll give you a warning. But mess with my honey? You just declared war. I walked back inside, my anger simmering into something sharper, something more focused. If Karen wanted honey so badly, I'd make sure she got it, just not in the way she expected. I had an idea, a beautifully ironic, slightly evil idea. But first, I needed to check on my hive. The bees were restless, their usual gentle buzzing tinged with irritation. They could tell something was off. Maybe they had felt the disturbance in their sacred honey supply, or maybe they just sensed my mood. Either way, they were with me. I leaned against the hive, looking out over my backyard, formulating the plan. Karen was predictable in the worst way. She took without asking, assumed she was above consequences, and never, ever admitted when she was wrong. That was about to change. Because if she loved my honey so much, I was going to give her more than she could handle. The first step? A little preparation. I needed the special honey, the one infused with a certain blend of natural pheromones. Normally, I used it to help guide lost bees back to their hive, but today, it had a new purpose. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining Karen's face when she realized what was happening, the slow, dawning horror as she realized the bees weren't just visiting. They were targeting. I was giddy with anticipation. The next morning, I set my trap. I left the jar in the usual spot, right on the shelf where she had stolen from before. I didn't even bother hiding it. If there was one thing I could count on, it was Karen's greed. And sure enough, by noon, she had struck again. But this time, things would be different. An hour later, as I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, I heard it, the distant, high-pitched shriek of someone in distress. I set my cup down and walked to the fence, peeking over just in time to see Karen flailing wildly in her backyard, her brunch guests scattering in terror. The bees had arrived. At first, it was just a few, drawn by the irresistible scent of the honey she had so generously smeared all over her charcuterie board. But then, as if summoned by the universe itself, more began to arrive. Dozens. Hundreds. Karen was screaming, running in circles, knocking over tables and bowls, her perfectly curated backyard descending into chaos. I watched as she tried to swat them away, which, of course, only made them angrier. Her guests were fleeing, shielding their mimosas as they sprinted for the house. One man dove into the pool, a dramatic leap worthy of an action movie. Another tripped over a chair and rolled into a hedge. Karen? She was still running, still flailing, still absolutely covered in bees. I should have felt bad. Really, I should have. But as I stood there, sipping my tea, watching karma do its thing, I couldn't help but smile. It was beautiful. Poetic. Justice in its purest form. And the best part? This was just the beginning. Karen had no idea what was coming. After watching her flee from her own brunch like a villain in a cartoon, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Karen never backed down, never admitted defeat. She wasn't the type to learn from her mistakes. No, she was the type to get angry, to blame others, to seek revenge. And I had no doubt that after she finished icing her stings and wiping the remnants of her disaster brunch off her overpriced yoga pants, she would be plotting her next move. Which meant I needed to be 2 steps ahead. The thing about dealing with people like Karen was that you couldn't just win once. You had to win in a way that made them never want to play the game again. And that required a level of patience, strategy, and just the right amount of chaos. Fortunately, I had all 3. I spent the rest of the day fine-tuning my plan. Karen thought she could take my honey without consequences, so I decided it was only fair to give her what she wanted, just with a little bonus she hadn't anticipated. My bees weren't just regular bees. They were disciplined, intelligent, and most importantly, they were mine. Over the years, I had learned how to work with them in ways most people couldn't even imagine. I prepared another special jar, but this time, I upped the ante. The honey wasn't just infused with pheromones. It had a particularly potent blend, one that would make Karen the most interesting thing in any area with bees. This wasn't just about attracting a few curious visitors. This was about making her an unavoidable beacon. I left the jar in the same spot, predictably within reach, and waited. Sure enough, Karen took the bait. She must have waited until she thought I wasn't home, but I knew better. I watched from my upstairs window as she crept into my yard, moving quickly but clumsily, stuffing the jar into her oversized purse like a raccoon stealing from a picnic. She barely glanced around before hurrying off, which told me everything I needed to know. She was furious about what had happened, but not enough to stop herself from doing the exact same thing again. I sat back, smiling to myself. Now, all I had to do was wait. Karen didn't just take the honey this time. She flaunted it. I overheard her bragging to her friends on the phone as she sat on her back patio, practically shouting so the whole neighborhood could hear. She was planning a do-over brunch, and she made a big point of saying that she had plenty of honey this time. The way she said it, smug and triumphant, made me shake my head. Some people just never learned. The morning of her brunch, I made sure I was outside, tending to my hives in full view. I wanted to see this unfold in real time. Karen had set up another elegant backyard spread, complete with ridiculous flower arrangements, expensive table settings, and a guest list full of people who didn't actually like each other but pretended to for social clout. The honey was placed front and center, drizzled over pastries, mixed into drinks, showcased like a trophy. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. People were eating, laughing, pretending to enjoy each other's company. But then it started. 1 bee. Then 2. Then 5. Then a dozen. At first, Karen ignored them, swatting lazily, assuming they were just a minor annoyance. But within minutes, it became clear that this wasn't just a few wandering insects. This was an event. The bees weren't just showing up. They were arriving, like they had received a formal invitation and weren't about to miss the party. Guests started noticing. People shifted uncomfortably, waving their hands as the bees hovered insistently over their plates. A woman shrieked when one landed on the rim of her mimosa. Another man tried to brush them away from the fruit platter but ended up knocking the entire thing onto the ground. Karen, in typical Karen fashion, refused to acknowledge reality. She kept smiling, kept laughing, kept pretending nothing was wrong. Until the bees turned their attention to her. The pheromones had worked perfectly. The moment the bees detected Karen, they focused on her with an intensity that was almost supernatural. They ignored the food, ignored the guests. They wanted her. She froze for half a second, trying to play it cool, but then one landed on her shoulder. Another on her hand. Another in her hair. That's when she lost it. She screamed, a loud, undignified screech that sent the entire brunch into full-blown chaos. People jumped up from their seats, knocking over tables, spilling drinks, shoving past each other in a frantic attempt to escape. Someone tripped over a decorative plant and took down a whole row of chairs like dominoes. And Karen? She was running. Arms flailing, face contorted in pure panic, she bolted across the yard, trying to outrun a swarm that had already decided she was their queen. Her guests abandoned ship, sprinting for the front yard, ducking into cars, leaving behind a once pristine brunch that now looked like the aftermath of a food fight. Plates were overturned, napkins were flying, and in the center of it all, Karen was still running, still screaming. She darted into her house, slamming the door behind her, but the problem with bees is that they don't care about doors. They find ways. They slip through cracks, hover outside windows, linger near vents. And from the noises echoing from inside, crashes, thuds, another scream, it was clear that Karen was still very much dealing with her new friends. I watched the scene unfold, sipping my tea, taking in the moment. It was satisfying. Not just because she had stolen from me, not just because she had refused to admit she was wrong, but because people like Karen always thought they were untouchable. They took what they wanted, assumed the world would never push back. But sometimes the world does push back. I had expected her to come storming into my yard, demanding answers, blaming me for what had happened. But instead, silence. Hours passed. The sun set. The brunch disaster became just another neighborhood story. It wasn't until the next morning that I saw her again. She emerged from her house cautiously, glancing around like she expected bees to ambush her at any moment. Her usual arrogance was gone, replaced with something almost resembling humility. Almost. She didn't say anything, didn't complain, didn't accuse, didn't so much as look in my direction. She just took one deep breath, got into her car, and drove off. I smiled to myself. Lesson learned. Or at the very least, lesson delivered. And the best part? If she ever did try to steal from me again, I had plenty more where that came from. For the first time in what felt like forever, Karen avoided me. No dramatic confrontations, no fake pleasantries, not even a passive-aggressive comment about my garden being an eyesore. It was almost eerie. She barely left her house, and when she did, she moved quickly, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if the bees were still lurking, waiting to strike. I had expected some kind of retaliation, maybe an over-the-top complaint to the homeowners association or a vague threat about calling animal control, but instead, I got silence. That should have been my first warning. A few days passed, and just as I was beginning to enjoy the rare peace, I found an envelope taped to my front door. The second I saw the fancy, embossed lettering on the front, I knew it was trouble. Nobody sends good news in an envelope that looks expensive. With a sigh, I tore it open and pulled out a stack of neatly printed papers. And then I saw it. Karen was suing me. For emotional distress. For negligence. For damages. I had to read it twice just to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. She was claiming that my bees had recklessly and intentionally attacked her, that I had orchestrated an unsafe environment, and that, somehow, I was responsible for the disaster that had unfolded in her backyard. The woman who had stolen from me, who had trespassed on my property multiple times, was now trying to drag me into court over bees. I let out a slow breath, resisting the overwhelming urge to laugh. This was classic Karen. When she couldn't win, she whined. When she couldn't control a situation, she turned it into a spectacle. And now, she was trying to flip the narrative, painting herself as the innocent victim of a bee-based attack. But here's the thing about Karen, she always underestimated people. She assumed everyone around her was either too stupid, too weak, or too afraid to fight back. And that was her biggest mistake. I grabbed my phone and called my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Lisa, who had the patience of a saint and the bite of a wolf. She listened to the details, sighed in a way that told me she wasn't even remotely surprised, and then said exactly what I wanted to hear. She doesn't have a case. If anything, you do. That was all I needed to hear. A week later, I found myself sitting in a small courtroom, watching as Karen, wearing a neck brace that I was certain was just for dramatic effect, recounted her trauma. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, acting like she had survived some kind of horror movie rather than a minor inconvenience caused entirely by her own greed. "They chased me," she whined, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "I couldn't escape. It was a nightmare." I folded my arms, waiting for my turn to speak. The judge, a middle-aged man who looked like he had dealt with more than his fair share of ridiculous cases, turned his tired gaze to me. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" I stood, cleared my throat, and smiled politely. "Yes, Your Honor. I have security footage." The room went silent. Karen's face froze mid-fake sniffle. I reached into my bag, pulled out a USB drive, and handed it to the bailiff. Seconds later, the video began playing on the courtroom's monitor. There was Karen, sneaking into my backyard, stealing the honey, and smirking like she had just won the lottery. The footage was crystal clear. It showed her rummaging through my shelves, tucking jars into her purse, and walking away without a hint of remorse. And then, for added effect, I had included a second clip, the brunch disaster. The court watched as Karen screamed, flailed, and sprinted through her yard while guests toppled furniture and dove into pools. It was chaos in high definition, and the best part? The bees weren't attacking. They were just there, drawn to the honey she had so enthusiastically smeared over everything. When the video ended, the judge leaned forward, rubbing his temples as if he had just developed a massive headache. "Miss Karen," he said, his voice dripping with exhaustion, "I have a few questions." Karen shifted in her seat, clutching her tissue like it was a lifeline. "Why, yes, Your Honor? Did you, or did you not, steal honey from the defendant?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. Opened it again, then let out a strangled noise that sounded like a mix between a cough and a whimper. The judge sighed. "I'll take that as a yes. And did the defendant, at any point, send the bees to attack you?" I mean, Miss Karen." She deflated like a balloon. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded, then shuffled some papers before looking directly at her. "I'm dismissing this case, and I strongly advise you to stay off your neighbor's property unless you want to be dealing with real legal trouble." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from grinning. Karen turned redder than a sunburn, but for once, she didn't argue. She just huffed, grabbed her ridiculous designer bag, and stormed out of the courtroom. I watched her go, shaking my head. Some people never learned. Lisa smirked at me. "Well, that was satisfying." I laughed. "Beyond satisfying." As I left the courthouse, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of victory, not just because I had won, but because Karen had finally faced real consequences for her actions. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about petty payback. It was about standing my ground and making sure she knew that some things weren't up for debate. A few days later, I was out in my yard tending to my hives when I saw her. Karen, standing by her car, looking at me like she wanted to say something but couldn't quite bring herself to. For a split second I thought maybe, just maybe, she was going to apologize, but instead, she scoffed, turned on her heel, and stomped into her house. I smiled, shaking my head. Some people really never learned. As I turned back to my bees, watching them buzz around their hive, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The honey was safe. The bees were happy. And Karen? Well, she'd think twice before messing with me again. And if she didn't? Well, I had plenty more honey where that came from.